Hello, my name is John Gabriel. I'm an interviewer with the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. Today we're here with Ben McKlveen. It's March 6th, 2012. We're at the Public Library, and our cameraman today is Brian Powers. Good morning. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure, sir.
Ben, this is your hour. It's your interview. But before we get started in your war experience, let's talk about what you did before the war, where you were born, and lead right up into it.
Okay, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm 90 years old this year.
Congratulations.
In 1922, and I was born in Pittsburgh. My dad was a machinist for the National Tube Company, which was U.S. Steel.
Huh.
And I laughingly say he wanted us to see the sun. And so we moved to Lorain, Ohio, because Pittsburgh was a kind of a very dirty town in those days. And he made a lateral move to the National Tube Company in Lorain. And I grew up in Lorain, Ohio. And in the 8th grade, I had a music education class that taught music appreciation. And I fell in love with the sound of the oboe and the English horn. And our teacher announced one day that the high school had a horn that they would loan anybody who would study it over the summer because they needed it for the high school band and orchestra. And I jumped on it. And so all through high school I was an oboe player in the band and the orchestra. And when I left high school, my band director had graduated from Murray State Teachers College down in Murray, Kentucky. And he sent a lot of us down there because it was a very cheap place to go to school. Room and board was $20 a month.
Wow. Wow.
And they gave me a small scholarship and an NYAS, National Youth Administration job. I made 10 cents an hour. And I got $10 a month out of that. And so when I would finish my first year, I went home, went to work in the steel mills.
What year would this have been, approximately? What year was this when you...
This was I graduated in 1940. My first year out was 1941. And my dad worked in the machine shop over there, but I went over and I went into the labor gang. Well, one day I ran across a neighbor of one of my very good friends, and he says, "Hey, you want to be a test carrier for me?" I said, "Sure." So it pays 4 cents an hour more. Great, I'll take all I can get. So I was a test carrier, meaning I carried the test spikes that they made on the pouring floor up to the chemistry lab, and I knocked all the heat numbers into them and took them up there, and then they drilled them and checked to see that the formula was right.
I see.
And steel is like making fudge, you know, and when it's done, and they pour it out, report it into ingots. Well, when vacation time came, I became a ladleman, and I helped at high sport. And that was interesting, and I did that for a couple summers before the war started. When the war started in 41, my roommate and I were both from Lorain, and we had 6 or 7 other guys from my hometown that were all down there with us. It was great. The reason I went down there was because the woodwind instructor was an oboe player. And so that I felt was a good connection. So I went down and studied with him. We avoided the draft until December of 42. My roommate was drafted in November of 42, and I managed to stave it off until January of 43.
How did you manage to do that?
Just by not registering down at Murray.
I see.
I registered in Lorain, and they had enough guys that they could pull out of, for the draft. They could pull them out put them in. So I didn't get drafted until January of 43. Went to Fort Hays, Columbus, where they outfitted us, put us on a train, and sent us west. And 3 days later, we wound up at Fort Lewis, Washington, where all of us went into the 44th Infantry Division, which was training there. And they began making us into soldiers.
Was the training tough?
It was kind of like camping out. You know, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
We were young guys then. You got to remember, it wasn't like becoming a Navy SEAL or anything. It was just, you know, a lot of marching and a lot of hard stuff. And we had a very fat boy from Cleveland. Oddly enough, used to keep Coca-Cola in his canteen. And he would fade after 4 or 5 miles of a hike, and they'd have to carry him in. And he eventually got out on just not being capable. But the rest of us went right on. Oh, along about, that was in January, along about March or April, they herded a bunch of us into a hall one day and gave us an electric-covered pencil and said, sit down and take this exam. Well, I had had the prudence to take a class in college algebra while I was still at Murray, figuring that I might be able to use this somewhere. And so I took the exam, and the next thing I knew, a bunch of us were on a train to Moscow, Idaho, which I was telling you about earlier. And we took some more tests, and then they put us all on another train, and we went to Corvallis, Oregon, to Oregon State College. And there we walked into one of the most interesting educational situations I had ever been in my life. There were just dozens of fine professors there, dying to teach, and they didn't have anybody. And here all these bright guys come in. We got a thing going here, boy. You know, it was something else. And the idea that the Army started with this Army Specialized program was that they could see in the future they were going to need linguists, they were going to need engineers, they were going to need doctors, and they were going to need geopoliticians, economists, and all that sort of thing. And they wanted to keep the colleges going, which were dying of attrition, and they wanted to train these people, especially doctors.
Mm-hmm.
And but as mysteriously as that program started, 11 months later, it ended.
I'll be darned.
Just, and there were rumors that it was going to go on. And I went into the infirmary in April.
Is this April 1943?
Yeah. No, this is 44 now.
Okay.
I went into the infirmary at Oregon State, and one of my classmates joined me. He was just kind of goofing off, and I said, "Hey, Scotty, what's new?" He says, I don't know. He says, I guess that the news is going around that they've canceled all Air Force enlistments, and I had tried to skitter out of that because I was afraid that this program was going to fold, and I wanted to get in and fly. No way. And my heart sunk. Oh boy. So they wound the whole program up, and we put us on a train, and they sent us down to Hunter Liggett Military Reservation, which is the old Hearst Estate down in California, which is adjacent to Camp Roberts.
Oh, sure.
Hundreds of acres up there.
Yes.
Well, they had 2 experimental divisions that they were working with, the 89th and the 71st, and they were running mock battles between these 2 divisions that were deprived of any sort of motor transportation.
Hmm.
We had, in the 89th, we had pack boards and carts, which we would tow around the mountains.
What's a
And the
packboard?
71st Division had mules.
Oh, what's a packboard?
Huh? Packboard? It's a board you put on your back
Oh, okay.
and you carry stuff.
Okay.
You know? And they had been experimenting with that division and those two divisions, and then they decided just about the time all of us Army Specialized Training guys came in that they could do with a triangular division what they were doing with this division, these two divisions, if they just take the transportation away from them. But it was an interesting experiment. And so then they reformed these two divisions. I don't remember where the 71st wound up, but we wound up a few weeks later in Butler, North Carolina at Camp Butler, which in Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, at Camp Butler, where we began training. Now, I'm still a foot soldier in a line company at this time. And I was walking up the street one night to go into town, and I heard instruments down the street. And I just sort of on my own, I took off and walked down the street. When I got down to the end of the street, there was the band barracks. And so I walked in and I said, "Hey, you guys need an oboe player?" And I thought this one sergeant was going to jump off his bed. "Oboe player," like, "Yeah, man, we're short." So they set up an appointment with me with the ward officer, and I told him I was going home on furlough shortly, and he said, "Bring your horn back and play for me." I came back and I played a C scale on the oboe, which I had not touched in over a year. He says, "I'll arrange for your transfer."
Oh, wow.
So now I'm in the band. Well, that was a stroke of luck because I enjoyed playing. I had been a jazz bass player in high school. So I'd also been a bass drummer in the marching band at Murray. So I became Available Jones. I am going to become and a sign painter. I'll do anything. So when they were reorganizing this band, they appointed a friend of mine, now a friend of mine, but this guy, he'd been kind of keeping his eye on me, and he made me his, he was made supply sergeant. I became his supply clerk. I was available. If you needed a quart of OD paint, or you needed a couple of suits of underwear or something like that, I'd go find it or I'd steal it. So there you go. And so that was, we were getting prepared then to go overseas, and we sort of knew it. And so during the winter then, they came around and they said, "Okay, we're going to give you now 33 hours of military police training." Well, with a band, what are you going to do with a band in combat, for God's sake? You're going to go out there and blow the horn of Jericho or something? No, you're not going to blow any walls down with trumpets and clarinets. So they could make us into command post guards. Oh, that would be a cushy job. Stretcher bearers? No, thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Put you with the medics. Or you could become combat military police. That's what our general appointed us to do. So we became an adjunct of the MP battalion.
Did they all along? Did they keep you up on your marksmanship and your weapons training and all like that?
Yeah. Now, see, when I was in the infantry, I became I was trained with the M1. When I got to the band, we carried carbines. It was a small M1.
I see.
But we had to do all that, and we had all the same kind of training. So we were ready to go. Well, then they sent us up to Miles Standish in Boston and put us on a ship with our division and a whole bunch of other ships they had up there. And then they went out, we joined another convoy coming up from New York. There were 80 ships in that convoy going over. This is the North Atlantic in January of 1945. And I'll never forget that ship as long as I live. It was the SS Bienville. It was a Liberty ship. And these were meant to haul a lot of freight. And they sat pretty low in the water with 5,000 guys on board, not very heavy.
Mm-hmm.
So it was riding about 6 feet high. And here we were in the North Atlantic in January. And we would get hit with crosswinds every once in a while where we would record 45-degree lists. So we would swing back and forth.
Oh, my goodness.
My supply sergeant, who, by the way, is 94 years old now, still alive, and lives in California.
Isn't that
He
great?
and I have been in contact for all these years.
Wow.
So anyway, he and I and two other guys are the only guys that are alive today from our band.
Mm.
But anyway, Cy wrote a wonderful book called Notes from a Musical War. And he tells stories that were funny stories about what had happened to the band when they were in Camp Roberts, California. But then they got with us, and so we had a lot of very bright guys in that band because many of us were former Army Specialized Training guys. In fact, our entire division was made up mostly of guys that had been in Army Specialized Training. So we're a very bright bunch, and it showed because we survived very well. There were certain survival tendencies that we knew about too. You know? So anyway, we're on our way over there, and well, it was relatively peaceful until we got. One night we were in almost entering the English Channel, and we had a submarine alert.
Tell me now.
I'd say there were about 80 ships that were spread out, and then we had several small corvettes that were running around us like sheepdogs. And all of a sudden, there was an announcement, very quiet announcement, everybody put your coats on, up on deck. And quiet. And when we got up there, the ship's engines all stopped, and everybody made a 30-degree turn to the left and just drifted. And we could hear those corvettes running around dropping depth charges.
No kidding.
Boom, you know, boom. So we're all sitting there, and I think poor Cy, my supply sergeant, was extremely prone to motion sickness.
Oh.
So he was flat on his back for the whole time we were going over there. It took us about 7 days to get over there. And so he was a mess, and I kept thinking, boy, if we go over, Cy, I'll try to stay with you, you know. And you think these things when you're supposed. And I was thinking, I don't want this guy to drown. So, but I don't know that any of us could have lasted too long in that water at that time. But we didn't have to, and the next day we went into the port of Le Havre, where there had been an enormous amount of damage, and we had to bring our ship in, which was light already, but then the captain saw that there was junk in the harbor, and there were ships that were sunk there, so he said, all hands on the starboard side. So we all went over to the side and made the ship list a little bit so it could get through construction. And we came back, tied up next to two sunken ships. They put planks over those two. And here we are in Le Havre, France, getting off the ship at 5 in the afternoon with all of our luggage and our instruments and everything. And we walked down the plank. And at the bottom, there was a Red Cross girl that shoved a donut in your mouth and poured coffee down your barrel and said, welcome to France.
Wow.
They put us in a bunch of 6x6 trucks, and they took us out to a brand new tent camp that they had erected. And when we got off, there was 6 inches of snow on the ground by that time, and 15 degrees.
Oof.
And so when we landed, and here we are all bundled up with our stuff, you know, and walking down with this one sergeant who was taking us down the line to our tent. And he said, "Oh, guys, try to stay within the white strips. We haven't got all the mines out of here yet."
Oh my goodness.
That was welcome news. But we got down there, and we got into this tent with no lights, no nothing. We had to put cots up. It's dark, it's midnight, and we had to put cots up and get ready for bed. One of my friends was a clarinet player next to me, and he was dying of the cold. I, on the other hand, had prudently smuggled a sleeping bag overseas in my duffel bag. So I dug my sleeping bag out and laid it out on my cot, and I gave him my 2 blankets. The next night I realized it was colder than hell, even with that. So I got one of my blankets back. So anyway, we were in, at that point, this was called Camp Lucky Strike, by the way. They were all named after cigarettes.
Camp Lucky Strike, okay.
Camp Lucky Strike, Camp Old Gold, Camp Philip Morris, and then up at Le Havre, right at Le Havre, there was another camp where they shipped guys back to the States by air, and that was called Camp Wings. There was a Wings cigarette at one time.
I'll be done.
And so that's where we sort of waited out the Battle of the Bulge. And it was a couple of weeks. Then they put us on a train, moved us up to a little town called Blangy, which was in northern France. And then we stayed there a few days. And then they put us on another train. By the way, we're riding, are you familiar with the term 40 and 8?
No.
Oh, that was a common thing during World War I. And it was a French designation for a boxcar. Carried 40 men or 8 horses. And that's what we rode in. And we weren't much better than well, a little better, but not much better than people going to concentration camps, because we were all packed in there, just taking you up there. And so we got up there to, we got into Luxembourg, where we learned that we were joining Patton's Third Army. Now, he had come up from the south, and once they got that bulge straightened out, and they got some gasoline behind him, he was ready to roll. And so I think we spent maybe one day in Luxembourg after we got there, and then they slapped MP brassards on all of us, and they took me in a Jeep out to a corner intersection, and they put me down, and they said, "When the guys come by, tell them they went that way." Yeah. There I was, all by myself, standing out there on the road.
Did you have your carbine with you?
No. And because it was pretty well cleared out at that point, but then it was just, a safety precaution. They had to have somebody on the road to give them directions. And so that was what that was my first MP job. So then they came around about 4 o'clock and picked us all up again and took us down. We had moved at that point almost to the Moselle River. In fact, we had moved to the Moselle River. And when we got there, the engineers were building a pontoon bridge across the river into a little town that was there. I don't even remember the name of it, but we were in Germany.
Huh.
And
did you see any German civilians?
oh yeah, but they kind of kept their distance, and they didn't want to fool with us. No soldiers yet.
Mm-hmm.
But the minute I came across the bridge, oh, I forgot to tell you, while we were sitting there in a line waiting, we were strafed.
By what type of plane?
I think they were Messerschmitts. But just one or two of them came by, and that was just kind of a last dying gasp, and scared the hell out of a lot of the guys. But we just dove under the trucks, and they went right on by. They didn't come back.
Anybody get hit?
No.
Good.
Very fortunate there. So then they let us go across the bridge, and Now the MPs are in charge of us now. Our warrant officers are along for the ride. Fortunately, one of our warrant officers was of German descent. And his father had been an oboe player in the Kiel Canal Symphony Orchestra. And Mr. Steggs spoke German fluently. So he was a valuable asset to these people because he could talk to the prisoners. And so we got over there. The first German soldiers I saw were 15 guys sitting along a low rock wall with their hands over their heads like this.
Was this after you crossed the Moselle River? After you crossed the Moselle River?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the first Germans I saw.
I'll be done.
So then the sergeant, MP sergeant came around and said, okay, McKlveen, you and Bauerschmidt, a flute player, and these two guys, and this, 4 of us, were to take care of these 4 prisoners, or these 15 prisoners. By that night, we had 273.
Wow. The 4 of you?
The 4 of us. Now, interesting thing about prisoners, they're like children. Because you take everything away from you that they can hurt you with. Razors, matches, knives, weapons, anything, and belts and stuff like that.
Yes.
So they could go around and hold their pants up. And but what makes them childlike is the fact that you have to feed them and you have to get them to the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
So prudently, we encapsulated these guys in the basement of the school that was there. And we were on 2 hours on, 4 hours off guard duty, 2 of us at a time. And mostly because we were relatively kind guys and that sort of thing, in the band at least, we would run these guys back and forth to the outhouse that was part of that complex. And then the next day, we had to feed them. So I took 2 or 3 guys and went up to a food depot, and we got cans of sea rations, and I had these guys carrying them back. And I didn't realize at that time how beat these prisoners were. Red-eyed, and this one guy was going along kind of stumbling with his box, and he turned to me and he said, "Bitte, Trinkwasser." What he wanted was a drink of water. So I took my canteen out and gave it to him, and he gulped it. I said, "Drink it." So he did. It perked him up enough that he could get his cans back. We distributed the food. And then we moved. After then division would come down and get them from us.
I see.
And take them back to Corps, and then they would go back to a prison camp somewhere.
Do you know what kind of unit these guys were from?
I had no idea.
I wondered if they'd been through some tough fighting and they were just worn out, or maybe they were.
They were because Patton was moving at the speed of light at those days.
Yes.
And they had been through it because they were backing up all the way from France, and they were a tired bunch by that time. Well,
Yeah.
we kept moving east, and then we got to the Rhine. After a while, now this is below Cologne, and we had 1st Army and 9th Army on either side of us, and we were the 3rd, and we were all kind of pushing us to go east. And I remember sitting up in the hills above the Rhine, several miles, while our artillery shelled the other side. You could hear those 155s going off and blasting shells into them. And then we all went down to the river, and the Rhine is a lot like the big Ohio here, at that point. And it's so wild you can get across it. Well, they built a pontoon bridge across there. And they had salvaged some, or kept some of the bridges from blowing up so that we had troops, going in on either side
Mm-hmm.
that had managed to get in. It's above Frankfurt and below Cologne. And we got to the other side, and just kept moving east.
Did you go over on the pontoon bridge?
Yeah,
It might have been
a
an
6x6 truck.
Oh boy.
You can watch it. Watch it roll. And
At this time, are you still acting as MPs or
we're MPs all the way.
all the
And
way?
in fact, what we had done is we put all of our instruments and band supplies and all that sort of stuff in a warehouse or something in Luxembourg.
Oh,
And so we were strictly soldiers, MPs. You know, we were doing what we were supposed to do at that point.
are you encountering more and more prisoners?
Huh?
You encountering more German prisoners?
Oh, sure. We had prisoners all the time.
All the time.
Uh,
Any of them give you trouble?
Hmm?
Did any of the prisoners give you trouble?
No, not me. One incident that happened was the guys were sitting there one night in town, Bad Schwellebach, which was a resort. We had 10,000 German prisoners there in hospitals,
Wow, a bunch.
and we walked guard. And there was an interesting thing about walking guard at night, or even in the daytime, if you can't see around the corner. If you hear somebody coming, there was a sign in the countersign. Sign might be, and so you challenge somebody, you'll say, halt, password. They would have to give you a password. That password might be Lucky Strike. And then they would say, countersign. And you would have to say, they're toasted. So it was all the sort of things like that that were esoteric to Americans that they couldn't figure out. But you had to know who you were looking at,
Yes.
especially in the dark. And so there was that sign and countersign thing that you did all the time. Well, we would, and we encountered hundreds of displaced persons that we had to guard also, that were sleeping in barns, and we had to feed them and all that sort of stuff. We had to look in on them to see that they were okay, nobody was dying to bring a baby or any of that nonsense. And so a bunch of our guys were sitting around one night in that area playing bridge. And the warrant officer came in and he said, hey, the guys just came up, and some civilians came around and said, there are some German prisoners that want to surrender up in the hills. See, Patton would pincer these units, and then he'd just leave them trapped wherever they were, and we'd be all around them, but they wouldn't fight because they didn't have any ammo, didn't have any food, and so they were just sort of trapped. Well, they decided that they wanted to surrender, they said.
Uh-huh.
So they came down and they propositioned somebody for some food, some civilians for some food. And they said they were going to come back at 7 o'clock. And so this is in the wintertime, you know, and so it got dark. Well, the warrant officer came in and said, any of you guys want to go take in some prisoners? So these four guys were bidding a bridge and they all passed. So they just threw their hands, and these four guys got up, a drummer, a flutist, a clarinet player, and another drummer. Said, oh yeah, we'll go with you. So they got their guns and took off, went down the road with an MP officer, and our warrant officer spoke German. So they got to the house, and they were inside talking to the residents. And then Mr. Stagg and the other guy went across the street just to sort of be a buffer. And the Germans showed up early.
Hmm.
So everybody doused the lights, and one guy went to a back window, one guy went upstairs, and the drummer, one drummer, stood in the hallway of the house behind the stairwell and waited for this entrance. Well, there was a German captain that started in the door, and Pete said to him, "Hands up." And the guy tried to look in the dark to see what was going on. And he couldn't see, so he backed out. And he pulled out his 2 pistols, and he came back in again.
Okay.
Bad move.
Yeah.
Pete shot him. And so the guy fell, and my God, that opened a firefight then with the guys that were in the hedgerow out front. Officers across, 2 of our guys are across the street. And my one drummer friend says, I was in this back bedroom. He says, I don't know what the hell to do. He says, I just put my gun up and I looked at the sign that was down there. It was a white sign. He says, I saw a guy run by, I pulled the trigger, and he says, I hit him in the leg.
Wow.
So this went on almost all night.
Oh my goodness.
And then in the morning, the captain was dead. And the guy that had been shot came in, and the rest of them gave up. So they took the whole gang of them, put them in a couple of jeeps, and brought them back into town, put the guy in the hospital, killed him. They all got bronze stars.
No kidding.
Yeah, they were decorated for that.
Good.
Yeah. So anyway, 4 guys in the band that were decorated with war heroes.
None of them got injured, right?
Huh?
None of our guys got hurt?
No.
Good.
We had two guys that did get hurt. One was going with an MP Corporal to a water point that we hadn't taken yet. And the machine gun was up there, and they sawed the driver in half with machine gun bullets, and took our other guy was sitting higher, and so he got it in the legs, and so he
no.
moved it.
Huh.
Trumpet player in the band. So anyway, there were some people that got hurt.
Yeah.
We moved on east. And as we got into the middle of Germany, we came into the town of Ohrdruf. And Ohrdruf was the site of the Ohrdruf concentration camp.
What date was this approximately?
Probably March or early April of 45. And that was the most amazing, disconcerting experience in the war for me. There were probably 20,000 Jews, gypsies, and other people in that camp. They all looked like sticks.
Were they men? All men or women or?
And the interesting paradox, as far as I'm concerned, about that was that there was a 17-year-old Jewish boy in that camp by the name of Henry Meyer. Does that ring any kind of a bell with you?
No.
Henry Meyer survived because he was a violinist. They didn't gas him. He got out and had relatives in New York. Managed to get to New York. He went to Juilliard, graduated, hooked up with 3 other Jewish boys, and they went under the name the LaSalle String Quartet. And they were in residence at the conservatory here in Cincinnati for 40 years.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing.
I knew Henry very well. I used to tune for him. But I never saw him with his sleeves up,
Uh-huh.
because he had the tattoo on the inside.
Sure.
When he retired, when he was 72, there was a background article in the Inquirer about him. And I said, my God, he and I were within 500 feet of each other at that time,
Yeah.
without knowing who we were, I never told Henry that I was there. He learned later from somebody, but I never ever talked to him about it because he was there out of evil design. I was there out of sheer chance.
Yes.
And the fact that I was with the division that liberated him was not significant, really. It was just happenstance.
When
That,
Go right ahead.
Hmm?
I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go right
no,
ahead.
that's it. But that was very touching. So if anybody says the Holocaust did not occur, they're in terrible denial, because there it is, and that is one of the most gruesome, awful, inhumane sights that you ever see. Patton and Eisenhower visited that camp. They both went over in a corner and threw up.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Did you see General Patton when you were in the service?
No, never laid eyes on the man. He was a good general. He was a little guy,
Yeah.
and he had a high, shrill voice. One of his attitudes concerned me rather much, and that was, I'll take that town if it takes a bushel of dog tags.
Oh, yeah. That would
Which
be
meant
concerning.
that he was all business, and when he was there, he was the conquering hero, and don't go in any other direction. That's what he was. Fine. I was proud to be with him because he was a good general. But we had different points of view about how things were going to be.
Do you mind if we go back for a second to talk about the camp you witnessed? When you got to the gates of the camp, had the soldiers already cleared out the guards?
Oh yeah.
Was there a fight?
Well, when I got there, see, we were coming up from behind.
Okay.
But yeah, they had the guys. The Germans were gone.
They'd fled.
They fled.
Oh.
Now this was a satellite camp to Belsen, which was
Okay.
just a little further north and west of Ordnance. So there were two of them right there. That I don't think we liberated Belsen, but we did Ordnance, and that was one. Then we moved over, eventually winding up with Patton in the town of Zwickau, which is right above the tip of Czechoslovakia. It's almost to the Polish border. And we were waiting we had 100,000 Germans trapped between us and the Russians at this point.
Wow.
And the war had slowed down tremendously by this time. And we were kind of waiting to see who was going to take Berlin. So we went, a bunch of us went back to Luxembourg and got our instruments and put together shows. In a matter of fact, the day the war ended was May the 8th. And our show was out doing a production for a tank battalion. And we were doing this in an old schoolhouse out in the country. And we had liberated two Volkswagen trucks that we had changed over from German to American, put a red white star on them. And I went out to the truck to get something because I was emceeing this show this day. And it was snowing on May the 8th
Wow.
in that part of Germany,
You must have
which
been
I will never forget. And I have a picture somewhere in my collection of the trucks and the building and snow falling.
son of a gun.
It was May the 8th. So anyway, that was when I got back, my warrant officer, or my supply sergeant said to me, hey, that's it. War's over. And I said, great. So for the next 48 hours, we watched, these Germans had arranged to surrender to us.
Rather than the Russians.
Rather, they didn't want to surrender to the Russians. So for the next 48 hours, these Germans marched through us with all their tanks, all their trucks, all their artillery, all their arms, everything they owned. In 10-minute march units, they would come through. 10 minutes later, here comes another. Like that for 48 straight hours.
Wow, that's a bunch of soldiers.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
And they went back and they said, "Where do you want us to park them?" "Put them over there. We give up."
Did you have facilities to take care of all these guys?
You know, I don't know, because that wasn't part of my job. But I assumed that they did. I mean, the Americans were not fools. They just go shooting through there and then, pile it up somewhere. They had plans. They made a lot of plans. And I have to hand it to our officers, because they knew what they were doing. And they got stuff done, and it was quite surprising. But, all this was pretty orderly. And there we started to go back in stages, and we moved from Zwickau to, which by the way was a beautiful town. Robert Schumann, the composer, was born in Zwickau. We ate, one more story on tragedy, we ate in our, you see the clothes, they're rough.
Sure.
We washed, these were all wool uniforms, which we washed with GI soap, so we were a bunch of roughneck looking, kind of cowboys, and we ate out of aluminum mess gear, and we went into this, they set up a chow hall in the second floor of this beautiful, beautiful restaurant in Zwickau, on a curved street. The buildings were all curved like the street. It was lovely. I'd never seen anything like that. And it was a really beautiful city, and it had been completely destroyed. However, the times were tough for the people who lived there. And we would go in. Now, I was in a band with a lot of very creative guys who could make almost anything out of nothing. And so we would have little parties at night where we would eat stuff that we would scavenge or pick up or whatever. And so breakfast was not always the most admirable meal of the day. We used to get pancakes, which were GI pancakes, nourishing but not necessarily very tasty. And we used to get artificial syrup, which looked like motor oil, sweet motor oil, and then dried eggs and stuff like that. And if we weren't very hungry, we always wouldn't finish what we got. And so we would start down the back steps of the restaurant to the garbage cans. Now, for those of you who don't know how they keep disease from spreading down there, they always had 3 cans with heaters in them that heated the water to boiling, and it was soapy, and you had to wash your gear 3 times.
Wow.
And then you had 3 more cans where you had to rinse them 3 times. And so you had the guys on KP that had to set all this up. And so there was a line of 6 cans down there at the bottom of the steps. We never got to throw any food away.
Really?
Well, you get down there and you're going to empty the garbage. There were old people, hundreds of old people, crying. They would take anything you didn't eat.
No kidding.
Anything you didn't eat. And they would have their little German lunch buckets there. You just pour it in there.
Son of a gun.
Now that was the second most degrading thing. Starvation is an ugly sight.
Mm.
And as I said when I worked for Ryan, war is wasteful. War is horrible. It's inhuman in so many ways, and I just wish there were other ways that we could settle things.
Yes.
But those experiences stick out in my mind as being significant and things that I just never want to see again. Now I can imagine, I cannot really recreate the experiences that guys have now in Iraq and Afghanistan compared to, it would be much worse compared, because war has escalated in its killing power.
Yes.
So it's not a nice thing to see. And I understand post-traumatic, post-combat syndrome. Some of our guys were a little shattered by just those experiences, but not badly. From there we went back to France and set up in Rouen, and we lived up on the hill, and we broke up into groups and played officers' clubs and enlisted men's clubs and all that sort of stuff. And then I said that was when they opened the schools up. This was maybe in June of 45. They opened the schools up, and my war officer came around and said, "How'd you like to go to study piano tuning in England?" And I said, come on. Piano tuners, blind people, old folks. I said, I'm gonna, how long is that class? 6 months? Oh, I'll be home.
Yeah.
Wrong. I was one of the younger ones at that time, and they had a point system, so you could get out. And the way the point system worked was it was 1 point for each month you were in the service, 1 point for each month you were overseas, and 1 point for each battle you were in. I had 49 points. It took 50 to get out.
Oh no.
So they split our band, and us kids went down to Linz, Austria, and joined another band that had been split the same way. And then we reorganized down there and played through the winter, 45, spring, and 46. And so eventually, in 46, we all were rounded back up and put on a boat in Le Havre and sent home. But it was an interesting experience. One of my friends in the band, again, another drummer, same guy that got the Bronze Star. Not the one who shot the German, but the other one, the one who got shot the guy in the leg, decided he would go. But he didn't want to be a piano tuner. He wanted to be a CPA, a certified public accountant. So he went to England. So long, George, I'll probably never see you again. But lots of luck. Well, George went, but then we split the band. And in February of 46, he came back. Well, he was a drummer and I was a bass player working. And so we began working together, and he kept me absolutely enthralled with what he'd been doing in England. First of all, he lived next door to the cultural correspondent for Life magazine.
Huh.
So he had tickets to everything going on in London. And I said, the thing that really frosted me was the fact that we'll get low on time.
Getting low on time.
Yeah, the frosted me was that he had seen my idol, Leon Goossens, who was the premier oboe player in the world at that time, in concert. I said, ooh, dummy. And so I was kicking my own behind all the way home. And then when I got to Cincinnati, I started studying with the first oboist. And he said, my dear, making a living as an oboe player is a very precarious occupation. If I were you, I would study something you can put on your back, which will go with you wherever the oboe takes you. Why don't you study piano tuning? When I was in Belgium, he said, I was a piano tuner and I had a franc in every pocket. Well, they were teaching a class there at the conservatory. So I took a year off between degrees and studied. And because of my background, I fit beautifully. I mean, I knew the math and the science and the physics behind the whole business of pianos and piano tuning. 4 years later, my piano tuning teacher retired. He had 55 years experience, no degree.
Wow.
I had 4 years experience, 3 degrees, and that made us equal. So they gave me the job. And I taught for 4 years. So that was the beginning of my career. And it was just sheer luck. But I took advantage of it.
That's great.
And so I've had now, this is my 62nd to 3rd year of working on pianos. And I've had more fun in the piano business than anybody has a right to expect from what he does for a living.
That is great. That's wonderful.
So that's pretty much my story.
Well, that story was interesting. I'm so glad you told it. I think it's worthwhile for generations going forward to hear it. Because, frankly, in the interviews I've done, not heard anyone speak about band member, being an MP, gathering prisoners. This is all tremendously educational, and I thought it was a great interview.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time. I appreciate your service.
My pleasure, sir.
If you have anything else to say, we've got about 3 minutes left. If you'd like to talk about your family or anything going forward.
Well, no, I think I pretty well ran out the string there.
Okay.
We came back on a ship, by the way, that was also a Liberty ship. This was, I can't remember the name of that one, but it was North Atlantic again, only we were going into the wind instead of with it. And I'm told that the waves did $10,000 worth of damage to the bow of this ship.
Oh my gosh.
But it would go up and then boom, that sort of thing. And it was a wild ride back too. So anyway.
Wow. Sounds awful.
The interesting thing there is that this is something we did because everybody did it. That was a holy war, that one. And there was a whole culture of damning the army and so forth and so on. But you were allowed to say that among yourselves, but when push came to shove, the guys were there and they did the job.
Thank God for that.
Yeah.
Well, Ben, thank you very much. I think our time's come to an end. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah. Take my picture.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is First Sergeant Keith Johnson. I'm a member of the U.S. Army Reserve. I've been asked to introduce our guest speaker today. I'm sure most of you here have heard the term the greatest generation, and that generation was those that participated in World War II. And the greatest generation was because of what they had to sacrifice and endure in the name of freedom for this country and the world in general. And so, Mr. Tech Sergeant 5, Ben McKlveen, was with the 89th Infantry and joined General Patton after the Battle of the Bulge. And hit the 89th, was instrumental in freeing some of the concentration camps in Germany. So I'm going to let him tell his story because he can do it a whole lot better than I can. Sir?
This is going to be as informal as I can make it in many ways. I will tell you a little bit about my background and all that sort of stuff. But I was one of the splinters in the American Army. I was, I was not a sergeant, I was a corporal. T5 is, a T4 is a sergeant. T5 is, you got 2 straps on your sleeve and a T underneath it, which is technical. I started out, I graduated from high school in 1940. So this year I'm going to be 90. And I got drafted. I went to college and studied a couple of years in southwestern Kentucky, and I was learning to be an oboe player. And I was studying music education, and the draft finally got most of us. And so I was drafted out of my hometown, which is in northern Ohio, and went to Fort Hayes in Columbus. And they fitted us all up with Army gear. And I got on a train, and 4 days later I was in Fort Lewis, Washington, where I joined the 44th Infantry Division as a recruit. I went through basic training, and before I finished basic training, they herded a bunch of us into a hall one day and gave us a test. And I thought, I'm going to take this and see where it leads. And so I did my very best on it. And the next thing I knew, I was on a train to Moscow, Idaho, University of Idaho, where we took some more tests. And then I was on another train and went to Corvallis, Oregon, which is the home, at that time, of Oregon State College. It's now Oregon State University. So they always say at Oregon State, I'm a beaver born and a beaver bred, and when I die, I'll be a beaver dead. So rah-rah for OSC. Anyway, I went there, and that was a remarkable college, and it was the beginning of the Army Specialized Training Program, which miraculously began because the Army needed doctors, it needed linguists, it needed geopoliticians, and it needed engineers. And so they were looking to keep the colleges open because the draft really cleaned out most of the able-bodied young American youth, male. And so we wound up at Oregon State, and I was in the engineering program. So it was an accelerated program. So I had 11 months of engineering crammed into me. It was 2 years worth of college, which was great fun, and we enjoyed it. That was one of my best years in the Army. But then as miraculously as that program began, it dissolved. And the reason was they needed troops. They needed able-bodied soldiers to get the Germans out of the mountains of Italy. And so we were all shoved back into the infantry. And I then went down to Northern California with the rest of my gang, and we joined the 89th Infantry Division. And they were down there maneuvering in fake battles against the 71st Division, where they were called light divisions. And the idea was they took away all our trucks and our jeeps, and they gave us pack boards, and we were fighting a division that was equipped with mules, which was kind of interesting. And so that was in the mountains of Southern California. And then they decided that that particular experiment was useful, but you could accomplish the same thing by taking the vehicles away from any organized triangular division and just letting them shoot for themselves. But they did learn a lot from that. And so then the division was reformed, and now I'm still in a line company as a rifleman. And we went then from there to North Carolina, down to Camp Butler, and we trained then as a regular infantry division. And then in January of '43, they shipped us up to Boston, put us on a bunch of boats, and they ran us over to Europe. That was a fascinating trip. It was dead winter, and the North Atlantic is not a calm sea. And we were aboard the SS Bienville. I will never forget that ship as long as I live. Because the SS Bienville was a Liberty ship, and it was meant to carry a lot of freight. Well, we had 5,000 soldiers on that ship, and we didn't weigh all that much, so we were high in the water. And whenever the waves would hit us, we would. So all of us were seasick as the devil. And so it was relatively uneventful until we got to, there were about 80 ships in that convoy. And when we got to the English Channel, one night, we were attacked by a wolf pack of submarines. And we had little corvettes that like small destroyers that just kind of circled us like sheepdogs to keep us in good shape. But boy, they all of a sudden, all the engines stopped, and all the ships turned 30 degrees to the left, and just stood still. But we could hear these guys running around out there, dropping depth charges and all that sort of stuff. And we're up there, it's 30 degrees, we're in our overcoats with red lights, wondering if we're going to have to go into the water. It's not a pretty project. But fortunately, they scared them off or whatever, and we got to Le Havre, which is in the north at the end of the Seine River at the top of France. That had been thoroughly bombed during the D-Days and following. And we were there almost a year after that. And the harbor was clogged with all kinds of sunken ships and stuff like that that had been bombed. And I remember when we went in, they wanted to get us into a particular dock. And so the captain called down to the troops. He said, "Hey, everybody over on the starboard side." So we all went over on the right side and stood trying to make the ship list a little bit so that we could get through this one spot and get into the harbor. They tied up against a wreck, put a gangplank over it. We got our duffel bags and our overcoats and our rifles. And we went over that ship, and then another ship, and then we walked down, and we were greeted at the bottom by a Red Cross girl who gave us a cup of coffee, put a donut over our rifle, and said, "Welcome to France." Question?
No, I'm just very impressed with the story. I'm sorry, keep going.
It was 15 degrees, and it was 6 inches of snow on the ground. They put us into trucks, and they drove us out to a bunch of fields, which there are 15,000 men in this division, and it takes a little bit of space to house all these guys in tents. So when we got out there, there was a caretaker group that met us after we got off the trucks, and we're looking at 6 inches of snow on the ground. And the sergeant that was taking us down to our tent said, "Be careful not to step off the white lines, because we haven't cleared all the mines yet." So we're all treading very lightly with our duffel bags down the line. And they put us in 8 and 10, 12 person tents. You know, like at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it's, as I say, it's maybe 25 degrees. And I had the foresight to anticipate that something like this might happen. And so, luckily, I smuggled in my baggage a sleeping bag. Because all everybody else had were 2 wool blankets and your cot. That was it. Now that can get kind of chilly. And so, now by this time, I have to say that when I was back at Camp Butner, I had walked up the street one night and I heard instruments playing down the street. And I went down the street and there was the band barracks. And so that was where I went in one day and I said, hey, does the band need an oboe player? They did. And so I went to the warrant officer and he said, bring your oboe back when you come back off of furlough and play for me and I'll arrange for your transfer. I played a C scale for the man. And he says, I'll arrange for your transfer. I was so happy to get into that band that you just can't believe. First working in the line company is hard work. And so I became available Jones. I not only played the oboe, I played the bass drum in the marching band, I played string bass in a dance group, and I was also the supply sergeant's right-hand man. I was the gopher. You needed a quart of OD paint, I'd go find it for you, or steal it. And so, so that was my job. And by the time we got to France, we were band, 56-piece band. What do you do with a band in wartime? Well, you could become stretcher bearers, which is not a terribly interesting project. You could become command post guards. Or the third choice is you can become combat military police. And that means you go with the infantry, and when they capture prisoners, you get them. And so we had 33 hours of training, and I could still go out and direct traffic. You know, so we stayed about 3 weeks in northern France. The weather abated somewhat, and then we went up to another little town and spent maybe a week there. The Battle of the Bulge was going on. How many of you remember that history, the Battle of the Bulge? That was Hitler's last stand in punching into the West. And that was a terrible winter, as you may remember. And there was a lot of frostbite and trench foot and stuff like that going on among the troops. But by the time that got straightened out, we were then assigned to join General Patton's army, Third Army. And just to give you an idea of how these are set up, an army is set up with a number of infantry divisions. They have tank divisions. We had the 4th and 11th Armored Tank Divisions with us. They have tank destroyers, and all of the infantry divisions have their own artillery groups. And you work as a giant unit to accomplish some military objective. And so we then got on a train. I have to tell you about getting on trains. How many of you are familiar with the term 40 and 8? Anybody know what 40 and 8 means? That is a European boxcar which during World War I would carry either 8 horses or 48 men. 40 men. So we got into boxcars, and you could sleep wherever you could find a flat spot. And it took us about a day and a half to get over there. Trains would go very slowly for some reason or another. And sometimes, just to alleviate the boredom, we would get off the train and run alongside for a while. And so going back to our first night with the cold, by the way, these camps these tent camps were named after American cigarettes. We were in Camp Lucky Strike. And there was Camp Chesterfield, Camp Old Gold, Camp Philip Morris, and then they had a camp that shipped guys back to the States from up on the coast, and they did it by air, because most of those guys were wounded, and that was named after, it was called Camp Wings, after an oddball cigarette that had come out about that time, which was named Wings. So those are those strange little things that go on at that particular time. We got into Luxembourg, which is a little tiny country that's just on the German border and the French border. It's very small. Went into the little town of Mersch, and total darkness, unloaded all our stuff, and got set up. And the next day, they put an MP Broussard on my arm. It stands for military police, for those of you who don't know. And took me in a Jeep out, put me down on a corner, and said, when the troops come by, tell them they went that way. And I stood there for, I guess, maybe 5-6 hours. And then they came around in the Jeep, they picked us all up, and they took us down, and we were in Germany then. And we had gotten as far as the Moselle River. And when we pulled in about 5 o'clock that day, the engineers were building a pontoon bridge across the Moselle River to get into this little town that was there. And the only time I was really shot at is we experienced a strafing from some odd little group of German pilots that were sent to harass us. And out of nowhere, they showed up, and boy, we were under the trucks like that, and then they were gone. And they finished the bridge. Nobody was hurt. And we went across, and I looked at my first German soldiers. 15 guys sitting there like this on the ground, leaning up against a stone wall. And we were, a flute player and myself were assigned to work with 2 of the regular military police battalion, which really wasn't a battalion, it was just a large company of military police. And the 4 of us then were assigned the job of looking after these 15 guys. Well, apparently the war was going very well at that time, because by 10 o'clock that night, we had 273. Now, when you get 273 prisoners, 2 things happen. One, they're reduced in many ways to being like children. You have to toilet them, you have to feed them, but they can be dangerous, and so you have to take everything away from them that can hurt you. Razors, cigarette lighters, matches, anything that could wound you. So we spent the evening then, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, taking these guys to the latrine, which was an outhouse behind this school. And we had these guys encapsulated in a room about this big under the school on this little town. The next day, the 4th Armored Division of our 4th Armored Division came through us in order to get up to the front lines. And they came across this pontoon bridge in 10-minute march units. And the Germans that were in that town just stood there in absolute amazement. They couldn't believe there were that many tanks in the whole world. But these guys just kept coming through there, and with their treads, they were tearing up the street, and up the hill they went, and went on out. And so then it was leapfrog. They would pick us up, take us forward, leap us up, take us forward, and we kept moving. Patton was a very good general, and he had a lot of control at that time. And we really overwhelmed the remaining troops that were there, but just by sheer numbers, there were more of us than there were of them. So we got down then to the edge of the Rhine River, and that was, of course, a major river thoroughfare, and to get across that, the Germans kept blowing up all the bridges, so we'd have to build a pontoon bridge to get across it. Germany is a beautiful country right there. It's wine country. It's the Moselle River. There's Moselle wines, and then there's the Rhine River. There are Rhine wines. It's really quite a lovely place. And there's a spot in the Rhine River called the Lorelei Rock, which in German mythology, there's some sprite that hangs out in this mountain or something and bewitches river travelers. And that was where we crossed the Rhine on a pontoon bridge. And as we moved east, about 4 days later, we got into the little town of Ohrdruf, Ohrdruf, and we liberated a concentration camp. That is a sight that I never, ever want to see again. And there were 20,000 Jews, gypsies, and so-called misfits or homosexuals or something in this camp. And they all looked like ghosts. They looked like skeletons. And a parallel story to this that affected me was that there was a young Jewish boy in this camp. He was 17 years old. His name was Henry Meyer. Henry Meyer was a violinist. He survived because the camp commandant wanted him to play fiddle for his dinner hour, so they didn't gas him. He managed to get out and survive. He had relatives in the United States, got to the United States, went to Juilliard, joined 3 other Jewish boys, formed the LaSalle String Quartet, and they were in residence at the Cincinnati Conservatory here in Cincinnati for 40 years. I knew Henry well. I never saw him with his sleeves up because he had the tattoo from the concentration camp on his inside of his wrist. But when he retired, when he was 72, it came out that he had been a prisoner in Ohrdruf, and he and I were within 500 feet of each other sometime during that encounter and never knew each other. And I never told Henry that I was there. He was there by evil design, and I was there by sheer chance. And so I really had nothing really major to do with his liberation, other than the fact that I was a splinter in this large group of troops that were there. But if anybody ever tells you that the Holocaust did not occur, they're lying to you. It did. It is so ugly that you can't believe it. And we went from there then further east and eventually wound up where we had 100,000 Germans trapped between us and the Russians. And that was over in the little town of Zwickau in East Germany, where incidentally Robert Schumann, the composer, was born. And beautiful city, a beautiful city. And it had not undergone too much damage, but it was quite a nice place. Well, the war stalemated right there for maybe a week or two because they were waiting for the Russians and the Americans and the British and the French to see who was going to take Berlin. And so we unpacked our instruments and put a show together, and we went out and entertained the troops. And on May the 8th, 1945, we were doing a show for a tank company in an old schoolhouse out in the country. Before the show started at 1 o'clock or something like that, I went out to one of the trucks to get something that I had forgotten. And on May the 8th, it was snowing in that part of the country. And it's another thing I'll never forget. Well, it was significant because that day when we came back to where we were living, my sergeant said, "Hey, Ben, war's over." Wow. You know, well, we kind of expected it, you know, but that's a great relief. And the Germans did not want to surrender to the Russians. So they worked it out with our general to surrender to us. And so for the next 48 hours, we watched German troops come through the city of Zwickau, 10-minute march units, with all their tanks, all their trucks, all their artillery, all their ammunition, everything. And then when they got to the other side of town, they said, "Where do you want us to park it?" And that was it. That cleaned it up. Took a little while for things to get kind of organized about our withdrawing. And our division eventually went back to the little town of Gotha, where Bach spent a third of his life. And then we went on back to France, to Rouen, where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, which is just about halfway between Paris and the port of Le Havre. We're back in Camp Lucky Strike again. And we the band and the military police were living up on a hill, very much like Mount Adams is to Cincinnati. Mount Saint-Magnon was to the city of Rouen. The Seine River runs through, and this little hill is off like Mount Adams is down here in Cincinnati. Now, we were living in an abandoned orphanage up there. So it was not in very good repair. And so our warrant officers then wisely decided that we needed a recreation room, or we needed a chow hall, and we needed some other things. So they requisitioned 4 tropical huts, which were prefabs, and you just put them together like Tinker Toys, you know. And so my supply sergeant and the band librarian and 2 of our assistants, myself and another guy, were given the job of building these barracks. Well, we didn't have anything else to do, and we weren't going home right away, so we just got really into it. And we requisitioned some levels and some engineering tools, and we built those things like they were going to be there for 1,000 years. And it was great fun. And a lot of the guys in the band didn't want to be bothered with it. They were busy organizing as dance groups, jazz groups, and that sort of stuff. And so we needed more help than we had. So we then requisitioned German prisoners, which were being kept in a compound down in Rouen. So we'd say, well, we need 4 guys today, or we need 5 guys today, and they would send these fellows up. And that was an interesting experience, because you learned that the people you've been fighting are not much different than you are. They just speak German. And our librarian was a polyglot. He was a very smart guy. He had been a school teacher in California. He was a good tuba player. He was a good cellist. He was a good conductor. and he was older. He's an old man at 38. You know, the rest of us were all kids in our early 20s, and he spoke fluent German. He spoke fluent Spanish. So we would get these prisoners up, and he would sit there at lunchtime, and he would read the funnies to them and translate it into German. And so that was kind of a fun thing to do. We had an interesting group of guys. We didn't get anybody that was hostile. Fortunately, we didn't get any hostile soldiers. They were all guys who were just delighted to be where they were, instead of being out there fighting. Of course, the war was over at this point. We had one guy who was 49 years old, and at that time, he had been in World War I as a prisoner. So he was serving as a prisoner of the Americans twice in his lifetime, which I found very, very interesting. There was a system that they cobbled together to get you to go home. And that was that they gave you a point system where you got 1 point for every month that you were in the Army, an extra point for every month that you were overseas, and another point for any major battles you were in. And at that time, I had 49 points. It took 50 to get out. So they split our band, and they sent us, those of us who didn't have enough points, they sent us down to Linz, Austria, and they sent the other guys home. And we reorganized then in the 83rd Division, and lived in Linz for another 6 or 8 months. And then it became our turn to come home. Along the idea of talking about hunger and that sort of thing, food was a major, major problem in Europe during all those years. The whole system of distribution and growing and processing was completely awry. And so, as GIs, if we went to Paris or we went to any other city, we had to eat our meals while we were gone in chow halls that were set up by the government, the American government. And so we were not allowed to eat in French restaurants. There was actually not that much food for the people. And so this prevailed to a greater degree in Austria. And I don't want to mention that, well, I didn't mention the fact that I was back in Zwickau, that beautiful city in the eastern part of Germany. We were always in combat gear with the boots and the jackets and all that sort of stuff. And you carry a mess gear in your belt that was aluminum and it folded up and the tools were inside and all that. And we would eat in a GI kitchen or GI food in this gorgeous restaurant, which was on the second floor of a building on a curved street. It was glass, it was really very modern looking. And we would stomp up the stairs and sit down at these little glass top tables and eat our food. Now, GI food is nourishing, but it's not the most interesting diet you can imagine. And a lot of stuff was dried or condensed or whatever. Milk was condensed and you had to put water in it. And maple syrup looked like motor oil. Tasted a little bit like it too. And so we'd go up and eat with pancakes or something for breakfast, and dried eggs, Spam. That's where Spam got its bad name, by the way. And I had a rather creative group of comrades in the band who liked to experiment with things, and they would dig around and see what they could find and barter and trade for. And so we used to have French fries and all kinds of stuff that these guys would pull together, for like snacks late at night. And then when we get there, we wouldn't be that hungry. So, you'd eat some of it. And so we were down the back stairs, and then they have 6 55-gallon cans, drums sitting there. And the first 3 are soapy, and they have heaters in them to keep the water boiling. Then they have 3 more, which are rinses, so that you don't wind up with dirty mess gear. And you had to go through all 6 of these things to clean your mess gear before you put it away. I don't remember a day where we ever got to a garbage can. Anybody went downstairs with something to eat, there were always a herd of old people there with their German lunch buckets, ready to eat whatever you didn't want. Now that is dehumanizing, and it's very degrading, and that's another thing I never ever want to see again. It is absolutely unbelievable that that kind of thing can happen, even accidentally. So it's a terrible sight. Going back to Austria, to Linz, we busied ourselves with different things while we were there. I studied a little German. I can say "Guten Morgen, mein Herr, womit kann ich Ihnen dienen?" still today. And took art lessons and just did things like that. And every once in a while, our warrant officer would get us together and we'd play a parade. But that was pretty much it as far as occupation duty was concerned. And the Austrians were quite friendly. And we were on the Danube River in Linz, and the Russians were directly across the river from us. And there was absolutely no contact allowed between the Russians and the Americans, for whatever reasons. I'm not terribly sure why. But that was interesting. I never saw a Russian soldier up close. I would see our guards on this bridge, the South Bridge, and the Russians on the bridge across the river. And that was it. We were staying at first in a bunch of little apartments down alongside the river. And there were probably a dozen of us sleeping in a room about that big, with a porcelain stove in the corner, which was briquette fed or coal fired or wood fired. And the young Austrian kids would come in the morning and they would say, "Hey, Yank, you want to eat breakfast?" They'd wake us up. So we would roll out, get dressed, and we would put on our raincoats. And we would go to the chow hall. One thing the American Army could do was to make bread. They made bread by the zillions of loaves, and it wasn't bad. And they imported from the United States enough orange marmalade to float a battleship. And we had canned butter. So we would get into line, and the bread would be the first thing we did. Well, each one of us would go through, and we would grab about 60 slices of bread, and then we'd butter it real quick. Then we would marmalade it real quick, and we would make this big sticky gooey sandwich about this big. Put it under our coats. Then we would go, when we finished breakfast, we would go back. And these kids would be sitting on the bunks. And they never asked. We would just take them out, and their eyes would get about that big. And we would say, here you are. And they would say, oh, thanks, Yank. And they would go home and feed their family. So that was just a kind of a really interesting sidelight that made you aware of the fact that there was a lot of hunger and a lot of suffering that went on. I want to emphasize several things. I said, I'm not a gung-ho GI. I am grateful for many things that I received in my service. And I served willingly because I thought that Hitler was one of the greatest scourges that ever hit the earth. And we had to get that cleaned up. There was just no way around it. And we did. However, my overall impression is that war is murderous, it's hell, it's wasteful, it kills thousands of people, and it maims untold thousands, and it is just absolutely horrendous. And I don't ever want to fight another one. Also, as I pointed out to you, the Holocaust did exist. Now, there's one thing more I want to make very clear, that this sort of thing was not limited only to the enemy. I want you to understand that the American troops could be just as evil and corrupt and misbehaving as the Germans or the Italians or the Japanese. And the lower down the economic scale you went, the more prejudice you found. I found it to be incredible that when we got back to France, there were members of our MP platoon who absolutely loathed the French and referred to them in the most derogatory term. Now, I personally am a Francophile. I like the French people, and I have visited France many, many times since then. I have skied there. I have been back to visit various cities. My wife is fluent as a French teacher, and therefore it's always a great joy to go there with her because she's very, very conversant with the French. We were over there about 15 years ago on a horse trip, where we were touring the Dordogne Valley in central France on horseback. We had ridden from one horse farm to another on the first day. And we were sitting there eating in Motel 6 accommodations, but gourmet food. And a Frenchman walked in and he spoke to the manager, and he looked at our group. There were 12 of us. And my only male companion was Judge Arthur Spiegel from the Second Court of Appeals in Cincinnati. And he was there with his wife, and I was there with mine on that trip. And the Frenchman said to the owner, he said, "Who's the group?" And they said, "Well, that's a group from Jean-Paul's people from over at Soudiac. You know, Annabelle. Annabelle was our guide." So he went over and he spoke to Annabelle, and he looked down the line, and Art and I, who had discovered that we like ribald stories, were sitting there telling bad stories to each other. And he came down and he stood across from us. And he said in halting English, "Were either one of you in the war?" Now this is 1996 now. Were either one of you in the war? Art spoke up right away. He said, yeah, but I was a Marine in the Pacific. And I said, well, I was with Patton's Third Army, and I lived in Rouen for 6 months. The man never broke his eye contact with me. He took one step backward, and he bowed. And he said, Monsieur, on the part of the French people, allow me to thank you for your contributions to saving France. I looked at this guy for a second and I thought, is he serious? The next instant I realized he was dead serious. He was a man about 60. He'd probably been a 10-year-old boy when the war was going on and could probably tell me stories that would curl my hair in that part of France. So I poured him a glass of wine and handed it to him and said, Je vous en prie, which means don't mention it. That was moving to me. I went back, the flip side of the coin to show you the French sense of humor. I went back to Paris, we went back to Paris, and I was standing, leaning on the hotel desk in the hotel where we were staying, waiting for the cab to come and take us to Charles de Gaulle Airport. And the hotel clerk was a guy about 40, maybe, and he was standing back there filing his nails. And I said, you know, this has been a very emotional experience for me because I haven't been in France in 50 years. He never looked up. He says, were you in the war? And he was filing his nails. And I said, yeah. Then he looked up and he said, on which side? I switched to French. I said, Monsieur, vous plaisantez. That means you joke. And he said, well, he smiled. He said, you have to remember, I was born in Berlin. I said, how long did you live there? He says, oh, only until I was 12. I speak more French than I do German. But it shows that even in Europe, much of World War is a historical abstraction to people who were not involved or were not there. And this man was about 40. He wasn't even born when the war was going on. So it is important, I think, that we have an opportunity once in a while to talk about these things and to stress some of the ugliness that occurs in all of this, but also the fact that there is a certain homogeneity of humanity that occurs, and this gets wildly aberrant with wartime. That's pretty much my story, ladies and gentlemen, and I wanted to make those particular points. If any of you have any questions, I'm available. So, any questions? One thing I will tell you, because I'm sure it will come up, I fortunately did not have to kill anybody. That was important to me because I bear that to my grave, I'm afraid. I remember taking some prisoners. It was that when we had that 270 group, I had to feed them. So I took 2 or 3 guys and put my carbine over my shoulder, and we walked back to a supply depot, and we got cans of C rations and K rations. And these guys carry them back. And when we were going back, I was looking at these prisoners, and they were red-eyed and tired and defeated. And this one guy was kind of staggering. He was a big, blonde German guy. He was staggering with this carton that he had on his shoulder. And he said to me finally, Bitte, Trinkwasser. Want a drink of water? So I pulled my canteen out, he put the can down, I gave him my canteen, and he drank the water. And he gave me the can back. He was Duncan, vielen Dank. He was very grateful. It's one of those little exchanges that you don't expect. But it was an act of kindness on my part because I felt sorry for him as a human being, not as a German soldier. Those conflicting emotions exist anytime you're a soldier. Anytime you're working in that sort of environment, there's always a terrible conflict. And you have to resolve it. And so I'm thinking about contemporary GIs that are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And war has become infinitely more destructive, infinitely more brutal than it was, if that's possible, and larger in some ways than anything that we went with in World War II. And World War II was kind of the last holy war because we were all really well aligned against the Axis powers. And it's a little bit less clear now what's motivating the other things besides conflicts of religion. And so that's always brutal. So those are the things that I wanted to leave with you and all this today. So these guys that have post-stress disorder, post-combat stress disorder, are really suffering. And I can well understand it, even though it didn't happen to me to the extent that it would have had I had been through other circumstances. So that's my story. Any questions? Yes.
Will you eat Spam today?
Yeah.
My father wouldn't touch it.
Yes. Let's say I don't
Order it.
order it, but if it turned up somewhere and it was that was it, okay, I'd eat it. I'm not that. Quick story. When we were in Camp Lucky Strike in the beginning of our trip over there, we had a supply line foul up. So I remember for the first 2 weeks we were there, we ate ham every day. I love ham, and I'll still eat it today, but the other thing was that we were hungry in that cold weather, and you would eat ham, chew on the bones, and eat the gristle to get some nourishment. And we used to go out and get GI bread and take it back and toast it over our little briquette burners, and we would buy liters of French cider and sit there and get half smashed before bedtime. So you could crawl into a very, very cold sack and sleep. But, you make adjustments. And, yeah, it's probably true that just depends on your point of view. Anything else? Yes?
Nowadays, soldiers can communicate with family overseas through Skype and email and et cetera. How often were you able to connect with your family when you were over in Germany and France?
Not as long.
And what is the period from beginning to end for you?
I was over there for 2 years.
So 2 Christmases.
Hmm.
2 Christmases?
Yeah. Thanksgiving and everything, Yeah, I celebrated my first wedding anniversary in Blangy. I remember I sent my wife a little bracelet that I bought somewhere for anniversary present, but that was, yeah, we were, there was no way they could do that then, you know. My wife went home to Northern Ohio. She worked at Bendix while I was gone. So that was it. And you put up with it. Anything else?
What did you do to kind of mentally get through all this? With all this stuff going on and being away from family that long?
It's an interesting question. We had a lot of mail, and you wrote lots of letters. And we used to try to drive our warrant officers crazy because they had to censor these letters. And so one of the great tricks that we used to do was just load these guys up with letters where we would have all sorts of stuff. They'd have to cut it out, you know. Give this son of a bitch something to do. and that was part of it. And then the other thing I want to impress you with is the fact that in a military unit like this, you are all in it together. And that makes a bond. My supply sergeant is still alive. He's 94 years old, and he's in California. And he and I have been in contact every year since we got back. My entire band used to have reunions up until a few years ago. There are only 4 of us left. So, see, those things. If you're in a situation where you're all there, unless somebody is not well, you manage to survive. And one other thing, we were in a European society, which is not that much different from ours. And so I made friends with musicians that were over there. I knew the first oboe player in the Paris Opera. He was an old gentleman by the name of Pierre Bijou, which means Peter Jewel. And I could visit with him. There was another guy I knew. And you made friends with these people. Another thing they did, which was extremely helpful, and it's odd that I wound up in piano tuning, which is what I do for a living, because I thought I wanted to be an oboe player. And I was offered an opportunity to study tuning in Italy, in England. They came around when we got back to France, and they opened up all the colleges in France and England, in Scotland, so that GIs could go, and it gave them scholarships to go there. Our guys went to the conservatory, we went to the Ritz University in Nancy, Oxford, all these English schools. Well, they came around and they gave one scholarship to each band. You want to go to England to study piano tuning? My warrant officer said to me one day, I said, piano tuning? Only drunks, blind people, and old men are piano tuners. That was my image of the profession. And I said, and how long was that class? 6, 7 months? I'll be home. He says, okay. So he gave it to another guy, a friend of mine who was a drummer, George, so long, I'll probably never see you again, but good luck. So George went to England, and they split the band, and George came back and joined us in February. And we began working together. I was a bass player, he was a drummer, so we were working jobs together, and he kept me absolutely enthralled with what he had done in England. First of all, he lived next door to the cultural correspondent for Life magazine. Had tickets to everything going on in London. And so the other thing that really frosted me was the fact that he heard my idol, Leon Goossens, who was the premier oboe player in the world at that time. He was Eugene Goossens' brother. When Gene Goossens conducted here. And he heard him recital. And I said, McKlveen, you must be out of your mind to have turned that opportunity down. And so I was kicking my own butt all the way home on the boat. And when I got to Cincinnati, I was studying with the first oboist in the symphony. He said to me one day, my dear, do you want to teach or do you want to play? I said, Maestro, I really want to play. And he says, okay, it will take me 3 years to make an oboe player. However, making a living as an oboe player is a very precarious occupation. If I were you, I would study something you can put on your back, which will go with you wherever the oboe takes you. If you go to Louisville or Kansas City or New Orleans or Atlanta, they have very short seasons. But we have to eat every day, keep a roof over our head. Why don't you study piano tuning? He said. When I was in Belgium, I was a piano tuner, and I had a franc in every pocket, which I thought was a cute Gallic expression to explain security. I got a franc in every pocket. They were teaching a class at the conservatory. I took a year off after my bachelor's degree, studied piano tuning, went back and got my master's in performance, played utility oboe with the symphony, played the Schubert Theater, did all kinds of things in freelance jobs, and ran a little piano tuning business. In 1952, my piano tuning teacher retired. He was 73 years old, 55 years in the business, no degree. I was 30, 3 degrees, and 4 years experience. That made us equal in the eyes of the administration, and they hired me. And I went back thinking, wow, this is an opportunity to really learn my craft. And so I went back and I taught at the conservatory for 4 years. And it propelled me into a profession which I have been doing now for 66 years. And I am still enthralled with working on pianos. And I find it to be, well, I tuned a piano yesterday at Xavier University for an art series, which I do the whole season. And I get to work with the best pianists in the world. And I coined the expression a number of years ago that I am the Sancho Panza to the pianistic Don Quixotes of the world. And and the first words out of my mouth are, yes, your grace, what can I do for you? And it is very, very satisfying to me. If you have their approbation, it just makes your day. And I had an interesting experience with Pablo Yarri when he first came. It was right after 9/11. And a young lady came in by the name of, it leaves me. Anyway, she was a French girl. And she came in and she literally threw her jacket on the floor and sat down and played a rehearsal. And when she was finished, the rehearsal was over, she went back and she was talking to Pablo. And then I introduced myself and I said, I'm your technician. We have to talk. So I said, okay, let's go talk. So she went out to the piano. She sat down and she said, there's not one note on this piano that has the same sound as the next note. And there's not one note on this piano that has the same touch as the next note. Okay. go practice and I'll fix it. So I worked 5 hours on that piano, getting it to be even. And I called her back in about 5 o'clock and she sat down. She says, oh, it's nice and even now. And she says, I like this note, and this note. If you can make the rest of the piano sound that way, I'll be happy. I said, you'll have it tomorrow. So I came in and was literally still working with the sound of those notes. And they threw me off the stage so that they could start an 11 o'clock concert. She went out and played that piano. And I was standing backstage when she came off. She went right by Pablo. Elaine Grimaud was her name. She went right by Pablo, came up, threw her arms around my neck, and she says, I cannot believe the change you made in that piano. It was actually fun to go play. Pablo was not happy. and we never did get along after that. But that made my week. And I've had hundreds of experiences like that. And so, I'm the happiest man alive in my craft because here I am, 90 years old, and I'm still out there working. And it's fun. There's another side of that coin, too. It extends from the very, very talented down to beginners. I used to tune for a classmate in Greenup, Kentucky. And she went out the door when I was tuning her piano one day, and she says, oh, by the way, if you have the time, I got a new pupil down here. And she's just down the street. And if you have time, drop in and tune her piano. So I went down, and this was a woman who lived with a whole family of boat and hunter and stud sons and husband. And she was a nice, demure little lady. And when I went to her door, she led me around the corner to this kind of a dismal little spinet. The half tone low, and there was all kinds of things wrong with it. And she said, I'd like to have this fixed up. So I worked until about 10 o'clock that night, getting her piano straightened up for her. And then she came in and she sat down and she took out a very simple version of, this was at Christmas time, O Little Town of Bethlehem. And she played it very hauntingly. And with tears in her eyes, she looked at me and she says, I knew it could be better. Now that made my week too. Because, I have made somebody happy with their instrument, and that's my job. And so that's, I don't have to say, what time is the interment? Or, you're gonna have to have your liver out, or anything like that. It's all uphill, but it usually works out. So that's, I don't want to keep you all forever here, but any more questions? Yes?
I'm curious about your crossing the Rhine. I'm trying to geographically get an idea of where, I'm not familiar with the small towns you were in. So is that north, like Essen, Cologne?
No, it's below Cologne.
Okay.
The Lorelei Rock is
Pardon
somewhat famous. The Lorelei Rock is somewhat famous
Yeah,
in German mythology.
it's further south.
And it's, our third army was pretty well centrally located. We had the 9th Army above us and the 7th Army below us.
Right.
And so that's what we were going through this way.
What about, I also wanted to ask you about, you said it was really cold, obviously. Was there a lot of illness, sickness within the ranks? Was that a problem? Not so much.
You'd be surprised. First of all, you learn to wear long underwear. And you learn to sleep in long underwear. And you do a lot of compromising with hygiene when you're over there.
Right.
One of the strangest pictures I have in my collection at home is a saxophone player friend of mine outside his tent at Camp Lucky Strike. He is stark naked except that he's got combat boots on and he's bathing himself out of hot water in his helmet. It's, maybe 35 degrees. And I think, how can you do that? Well, he did it. And not many people got colds or got sick. There's a certain stress that's indigenous to the job of being a soldier that keeps you pretty healthy. And if you eat regularly, you're okay. Now, having said that, it sets you up also to endure a lot of vicissitudes that come your way as a result of circumstances that you can't control. And so you may have to go without a meal or one thing or another, or you may have to force march, or you may have to do this or that or the other thing, which stresses you a little. But eventually, they were reasonable about giving you off time or giving you a chance to warm up or whatever. Now, it didn't. The year that I left, the combat time that I was there, the war was over in 5 months after I got there.
Right.
So we were going from dead winter into spring, and by the time we got down to June or July, it was lovely in France, and it was very nice. And so we lived through that. Now, when we went back down to Austria, it was winter again. So that was tough. But we managed, and I don't remember anybody really suffering from any serious disorders. Sick call was not lined up every day with people that were about to pass out. No, we stayed well. Again, that's an interesting, it's an interesting phenomenon, but that's the way I saw it. Answer your question?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you tell a little bit about General Patton and what his personality was like?
General Patton was a piece of work. I never saw the man, but I had all kinds of stories about him that I don't know when they made the movie with George C. Scott. George C. Scott was about half again bigger than General Patton. Patton was a little guy with a voice that was like a chipmunk. And one of his favorite expressions was, "I'll take that town if it takes a bushel of dog tags." Bushel of dog tags. That's a lot of GIs. Do you know what dog tags are? All right. You got 2 of them around your neck. One of them goes with the burial people, and the other one, and you're on the ground. So, but he was a tactician, and he was not a terribly tolerant man. He was a believer in reincarnation. Some of the things that they quoted in the movie were accurate. For instance, he did say when he got on Rummel's case in North Africa, "You magnificent son of a bitch, I read your book." So that's why I was able to beat him. And but he could be rough too, and he was, and got into trouble with shooting his mouth off. And General Bradley used to say to him, General, keep your mouth shut. You know, you've got too much to say. But as far as his leadership was concerned, I was happy to be with him because we knew where we were going, and we got there. And another thing about him was he was not insensitive. When we were at Ordruff, he and Eisenhower came by to inspect the camp. And they got in there and walked around for a little bit. Both went over into the corner and threw up. Eisenhower and Patton upchucked at that site. So it gives you some idea of what, those are just generalities about Patton. Is there something I told you that I've missed?
It was just, I asked you what he was like, and you had mentioned George C. Scott was the big burly man.
Yeah.
With the deep voice, and then Patton was short and
Little.
and
Yeah.
had the squeaky voice.
And so what he did in order to make up for size is he went for flash and glitz. His helmet was lacquered so that it was a bright, shiny OD. It wasn't olive drab, it was just olive, shiny olive. And he carried pearl handle pistols and you know, all that sort of stuff. And so he was a real cowboy. But that was just making up for his short stature and his maybe some insecurity of one kind or another. But you know, he was not the most brilliant student at West Point, but he was good. And he had a practicality about him that was quite remarkable. And he surrounded himself with good people who buffered for him. That was his other bit of wisdom. So, any other questions? Thank you so much for letting me come by.